Thank you, everyone. We're so glad you're here this evening. For those of you who attended the first virtual vegetable short course session, a change in housekeeping. You may have noticed that the chat has been disabled for participants, but throughout the virtual vegetable short course, if you have questions, you'll be able to put those in the Q&A. Please know that your microphones are muted and you're not on camera, so you can feel free to relax. And for anyone who just jumped on, welcome. We're very excited for our second night of the virtual vegetable short course. This is night 2 of 4, so we certainly look forward to seeing all of you again next week, next Tuesday and Thursday. I am your co-host this evening, Christine Lang. I'm an assistant professor and SDSU Extension Consumer Horticulture Specialist. I'm based in Brookings, but have statewide responsibilities, and I get the pleasure of working with master gardeners, home gardeners, and collaborating with our specialty crop producers as it relates to vegetable research and cut flower production. And joining me this evening is Dr. Rhoda Burrows. Rhoda, would you like to introduce yourself?
Sure. I'm Rhoda Burrows, as she already said. I'm a horticulture extension specialist for South Dakota, specializing particularly with fruit and vegetable growers across the state. I also do producer food safety, and I'm going to be watching your chat questions, or not your chat questions, sorry, your Q&A questions as you drop them in the Q&A, and we'll ask those questions, I believe, at the end of the session. So feel free to put them in at any point.
Excellent. Thank you, Rhoda. So one thing I just wanted to share from Tuesday night is thanks to everyone who completed our post-event survey, we were able to see where people tuned in from. And we had an attendee all the way up from Alaska. They let us know that they're planning on moving to South Dakota. So we have a national audience tonight, Jordan, hopefully, if that person tuned in again. So shameless plug at the end of the event, please give us your feedback because it lets us make cool maps like this to know where everyone's joining us from. So another housekeeping item, I'd be remiss if I didn't offer a word of thanks to the South Dakota Department of Natural Resources, Agriculture and Natural Resources for administering a USDA specialty crop block grant that provided the funding for this 4-part series. And again, as Rhoda indicated, we're going to hear from our presenter tonight. And as he goes through his presentation, if you think of questions, please do put those in the Q&A. And we've accounted for at least half an hour for Q&A at the end of tonight's session. So it's my extreme pleasure to welcome Jordan Scheibel from Middle Way Farm. He's joining us from Grinnell, Iowa. And Jordan grew up in rural Connecticut and is a first-generation Iowa farmer, leasing land just north of Grinnell. After graduating from Grinnell College in 2009, he worked for a medium-scale certified organic vegetable farm for several years before starting his own farm in 2013 at age 24. And this farm is an organically managed market garden that supplies produce directly to his community. Over the last 10 years, the farm has grown to over 2 acres of intensive production, including a heated propagation greenhouse and a minimally heated 96 by 30 high tunnel, averaging around $100,000 in gross annual revenue and employing up to 5 part-time seasonal workers. Jordan uses community-supported agriculture shares, an online farm stand, consumer buying clubs and co-ops, a local grocery store, and the local college dining services to sell his produce from May to December and beyond. And as someone who's had the pleasure of touring Jordan's farm, he has a lot of great ideas, and I know we're all going to learn a lot this evening. So Jordan, virtual round of applause, welcome, and the floor is yours.
Thank you, Christine. Thank you, Rhoda. Hello, everyone. I'm going to share my screen now for my presentation. Okay. So, and I'll put the screen up at the end too, so that we'll have my website. You can follow me on social media at Facebook and Instagram, and my email as well. Feel free, if you have questions after the presentation, you want to get in touch with me to discuss something, feel free to reach out. I share this in the spirit of I've gotten a lot of good information from other farmers over the years. I started out farming without really knowing what I was doing, and most of what I've learned is through other farmers. And so I really, really value farmer to farmer sharing, and farmers sharing what they know, and being very open and transparent about their practices and their farms. So I share this all in that spirit, and hopefully that you can do the same, that you can pass on things that you know to other people as you gain experience, as you have the ability to pass things on. So the presentation that is called Evolving Strategies and Tactics for Organic Weed Control. So just to give you a little bit of context for my farm, Christine did a good job introducing me, but just to fill in some more details, this year will be my 11th growing season. I've been farming full-time since 2016. The land I use is leased from a family here in Grinnell. I actually live in town, and I have a short commute out to the farm. I'm married, but my wife does not work on the farm. She has a different job. But this is my personal full-time income. I've currently got about 2 1/3 acres in production, and we're actually adding another acre this year. This is the first time we've expanded in, I think, about six or 7 years. We have the high tunnel, which was mentioned, and we do have some perennials, and we're actually going to be adding roughly an acre of asparagus this year. I had been harvesting asparagus from a neighbor, but that is kind of falling through, and so I'm seeing the need to plant more asparagus. We are certified naturally grown as of last year. So for years, we had just kind of marketed ourselves as chemical free, toyed with the idea of becoming certified organic, had been intimidated by the paperwork and the just kind of getting that all done and across the finish line. So we decided to do certified naturally grown. It's just a little bit more straightforward, a little bit easier, and is a certification that does say that we are chemical free. Our marketing season is May through December, and we do some marketing through the winter. I'm actually selling spinach right now, and usually we have root crops this time of year as well. My main markets are Grinnell. It's about 10,000 people. It's a college town. Grinnell College is here. I actually went to Grinnell College. That's how I ended up in Grinnell. We also market in a town, Newton, that's about 20 minutes down the road, 15,000 people. And then the Des Moines Metro is about an hour away from us. That's 200,000 people plus 500,000 in the entire metro area. And we're just kind of barely scratching the surface of Des Moines. We do CSA shares in the online farm stand, which was mentioned. We started doing that after we stopped doing farmers market in 2020 during the pandemic. We do a few online co-ops and farmers markets, and then wholesale. And wholesale has become increasingly important for us over the last couple of years. And then, as mentioned, we have about 4 to 5 people on staff in any given year, and gross around $100,000 a year in product sales, and hoping to increase that this coming year. But I just want to show you some pictures, the bad, the good, and the ugly. And this is the bad and the ugly. So I've had plenty of weed problems over the course of my farming career, and I would say that I started out rather bad at weed control, and I've been slowly getting better. But that's to say that even the best farmers have weed problems, and actually even the best laid plans for weed control can go awry because of weather, because of unexpected things coming up in life, because of equipment failures, because of labor falling through. So that's to say that in organic weed control, nothing is guaranteed. And so you just try to incrementally improve and try to put forth your best plan. And I think it's important to see failure as feedback. It's really easy to walk out into a field and see a bunch of lamb's quarter and amaranth and foxtail going to seed and just feel discouraged and feel like you don't know what you're doing or you're failing. But it's important to kind of understand what's the root cause. Like, why is this happening? What were the things that led up to this point, so that you can start to trace back and figure out ways to improve what you're doing. And so my weed control tactics have had to change over time. And that's partly because my early years, we let a lot of weed seed fall on the soil. And so the result of that is we have fairly high weed pressure now. And so as a result, we've had to kind of change what we've been doing to adapt to that weed pressure. And then also I've just been learning more about how to get better at weed control. And so over the course of this presentation, I'm going to talk about a lot of things that we've tried and what I think are the good and the bad things, or the positive and negative things about all those techniques. And then I'm going to kind of end with where we're moving right now. So something that I'm a little less experienced with, but is the direction we're moving as a farm. So just to kind of lay the groundwork of what I think are like the basic principles of organic weed control. First of all, I think 100% weed control is not necessarily the goal. So the goal is not necessarily having an absolutely clean field with not a weed in it. And I think that sometimes, I live here in Iowa where we have a lot of conventional row crops around us. And it seems like the standard there is not a weed in the field. There's very much a kind of ethos around having absolutely clean fields. And I think that that is not actually helpful. I think that has much more to do with pride than it has to do with practicality. And so I think it's figuring out what is enough, what is effective weed control. What is that going to look like on your farm? And that may not be a spotless field with no weeds in it. I think effective weed control looks like weed growth is not compromising your crop health and yield, and weeds are not interfering with your ability to then transition that field into another crop or a cover crop. And in particular, your weeds are not going to seed. I think that's very important, is that even if your weed control is failing, you need to try to make sure that those weeds do not go to seed. And the rule of thumb that I always heard when I was starting out was 1 year of seed is equals to 7 years of weeding. That, if you let those seeds fall in the soil, that's going to be many years of weed problems going forward. And one tip that I'll share that I actually learned from, I think it was through a study by Matt Liebman, who works at Iowa State University, actually works on row crop systems, is that if your weeds are going to seed, like in the fall, if you have weeds going to seed, it's important not to disturb the soil that fall. Just leave that, don't plow it up, don't till it, just leave it. And over the course of the winter, actually a significant percentage of that weed seed is going to get eaten or lose viability. It's going to get eaten by mice or birds or other critters. So that's sometimes counterintuitive because we think we want to clean up the field at the end of the year, but that's something that I've practiced. I had a field that got away from me this year, and I just let it go, let the weeds stand there in the field. And then also, having those weeds in the field provides some cover, which means that things like mice and other animals might be more willing to move into that area to actually eat the weed seed. So when you're tilling it in, you're just putting it into your soil. So it's better to leave it on the surface for the winter. I think it's really important. I'm not going to really get into this much in this presentation. I'm going to talk more about tools and techniques, but it's really important to understand the seasons and the life cycles of your dominant weeds. And it's important just to know what your dominant weeds are, to be able to identify them, to figure out what their names are, figure out what type of plant they are, what's their life cycle. So there's kind of 4 basic life cycles, and this is just kind of my understanding as a farmer, but there's winter annuals, which are plants that actually germinate, weeds that actually germinate in the fall, and then they overwinter, and then they go to flower earlier in the spring. So like in May here in Iowa. And then there's cool season annuals that are things that tend to germinate early in the year when the soil is cooler, and then they're going to try to go to seed more quickly before the hot weather comes. And then you've got warm season annuals, which would be a lot of the weeds that I struggle with on the farm, which would be foxtail, crabgrass, amaranth, lamb's quarter, buttonweed. So these are weeds that aren't going to germinate until the soil reaches a certain temperature. So typically it's not till later in April, May that you're going to start to see those. And then you've got perennials, which are plants that have roots that will come back from the root year after year. And so a couple of the perennials that we really struggle with are thistles and quackgrass. And so all those different types of weeds have different methods and timing for controlling them. So that's just important to understand. And to give you an example, I know someone in Iowa who was talking about using tarps, which I will talk about later in the presentation, to try to control. They were going to put tarps on over the winter, and they were doing that because they wanted to control the weeds that they had during the summer, because they had a lot of grasses in their field during the summer. And so my advice was, if you put a tarp on over the winter, that's not the time of year when those plants are present. And so you're not actually controlling those plants. They're just seeds at that point in the soil. So the tarp is not doing anything to take care of those warm season plants. It would work with a winter annual, for example, because winter annuals overwinter over the course of from fall to spring. So if you put a tarp down over the winter, you might actually kill those plants. So it's really important to match your controls to the actual weeds you have in your field. And then I'll just throw this out there. Again, not something I'm going to cover in this presentation, but your dominant weeds can give you an indication about the physical condition and the biochemical composition of your soil. So certain weeds tend to favor certain types of soil, whether they're moist or dry or compacted or loose or fertile, or they might have deficiencies of certain nutrients or micronutrients, or they might have excesses of certain nutrients. And so by changing your soil conditions, improving your soil conditions over time, you can alleviate some of these weed problems, but you can't eliminate weed problems because you're still going to have that weed seed in your soil. But it's important to understand that improving your soil over time, following good soil health practices is part of weed control. So just to talk a little about what I mean about strategy versus tactics, this is something that I always would kind of get confused, or I wasn't sure what they would mean. They're kind of business plan sort of jargon, but a strategy is kind of an overall approach that you're taking. It's kind of a larger plan of action that you're taking to move towards a goal. And it's kind of based on, it's a long-term strategy. A tactic, on the other hand, is a concrete step. It's a tool or a technique that you're using as part of that strategy. So it's more of a short-term action. And it's something that you can change readily, or it's something that you can adjust on the fly, or you might try this tactic or that tactic. Whereas a strategy tends to be something that you change more slowly. And in all the strategies that I'm going to talk about, I use a combination of all of these strategies on the farm. It's not as though I've said, oh, I don't use this strategy anymore, but the tactics that I'm using within those strategies have tended to change over time. So I think of these as kind of the three overall strategies that I use and most organic producers use to control weeds. So the first one is the most basic one, which is that you're going to try to keep your soil covered and undisturbed. And that's going to prevent seeds from germinating in the first place, or it's going to smother them if they do. So, and we'll talk about some tactics that fall under that strategy. The second major strategy would be shallow soil disturbance. So actually killing weeds after they've germinated. And the emphasis here is on shallow because deeper disturbance tends to bring more weed seed up to the surface. And most of the weeds that you're going to have problems with, annuals, they germinate in the top 2 inches of the soil. So just that top 2 inches is where most of the weed growth is happening. And so that's where most of the cultivation should be occurring as well. And then the third strategy I think of is, if all else fails, or in some cases not, sometimes it's part of your intentional strategy, is you're going to try to destroy larger weeds to prevent them from damaging the crop or to prevent them from actually going to seed. So these are the tactics that I think kind of fall under the rubric of each of these, and I'm going to talk about each of these through the course of the presentation. So we're going to talk about various kinds of mulching. We're going to talk about cover cropping and no-till, which actually I originally got connected with Christine through a grant that I did for through USDA SARE, Farmer and Rancher Grant. I had a successful project in 2020 and 2021 with another farm in Iowa, Humble Hands Harvest in Dakota, Iowa. And we both studied no-till on our small scale no-till on our farms as compared to our sort of normal just rototilling. And so the portion of the presentation where I talk about no-till is going to be informed by some of the things I learned over the course of that 2-year experiment. Shallow soil disturbance. So I'll talk about hand cultivation, the techniques that we've used most often. I'll talk about stale or false seed bedding, which we have done a little bit of that, and we're actually looking to do more. And then I'll talk about mechanical cultivation, which is really the direction in which we're moving on the farm. And then last, I'll touch on hand weeding, kind of when it makes sense, when it doesn't. And then a little bit about mowing and some of the ways that we've used mowing to kind of help us rescue plantings or control weeds. So let's talk about keeping the soil covered and undisturbed to start with. So I think a lot of farmers, if you're growing, for example, garlic is a crop that typically you would mulch with straw. That's the traditional practice with garlic. So I think if you're mulching anything, it's likely that you're mulching garlic with straw. But growers might also be mulching other crops. For example, tomatoes is another crop that might be commonly mulched, or you might be mulching cucurbits, melons, winter squash. So here is a picture of our garlic field from a number of years ago. We actually used hay. So you can see there's some kind of spent hay bales in the back of the photo. And we were using hay. Typically you would use straw. Hay tends to get more matted down, but these were spoiled hay bales that were free to us. So we were using those. So hay, straw, leaves would be another good natural mulch that you can often get in large amounts. And then grass clippings would probably be the most marginal, although that's often used on a smaller scale. the issues I found with grass clippings tend to be, it's hard to get them in a large quantity. You have to either collect them or get them from someone else. There can be issues with herbicide carryover on grass clippings if those are being applied to the lawn. And then also you have to spread them quickly because they're so full of nitrogen and wet that they tend to, if you pile them up, they tend to rot immediately. So you need to spread them out and dry them out quickly. So yeah, we've used old hay. More recently, we've used straw. We do have straw available on the farm because we've established some hay fields. And so we've had oats in the rotation and been able to have some straw stored up for multiple years in the barn. We have used leaves either through having people bring leaves to us. So people bag their leaves and then they bring them out to us because they'd have to dispose of them anyway. And more recently, we've had Grinnell College, their facilities management has sort of a large mower vacuum that they use to clean up all the leaves on their campus. And then they dump those. And so they actually will bring that out to the farm and dump that. And it's a large quantity of actually chopped up leaves, which is kind of nice for mulching. This is my friend John Yagla, who farms in Iowa City. He has kind of a micro urban farm right within the city, right in the neighborhood where he grew up. And he uses a really interesting no-till technique where he uses, these are leaves that he gets from the city that they dump them in his front yard, and then he moves them to his various plots. And they are chopped up leaves. They're leaves that have generally been pulled out of parks or off of the street. And so they go through a vacuum and they get shredded up a little bit. And so he doesn't till, he just uses these leaves to cover the soil and to prevent weed growth. And then when he wants to plant, he just rakes them away, plants his plants, and then rakes them back into place. And you can see this plot is quite clean. There's very few weeds here. So I think this is quite a viable technique for a smaller scale to use basically a permanent mulch. And he adds leaves because the leaves do break down over time. So he has to keep adding it to his plots. But this basically allows him to not have to do much weeding, but also he has the opportunity to pull that mulch away and he can still weed the bare soil and then put the mulch back in place. We've done a little bit on the farm. This is from our high tunnel, mulching some overwintered onions in our high tunnel with leaves, but certainly nothing like John has done on his farm. So to sum up kind of my opinions of natural mulches, I think for the pros, season-long weed suppression, if you apply it early enough and thick enough, so you need to apply this before you actually have weeds germinating. If you have weeds germinating, sometimes they're going to push right up through the mulch. And so it's important to put it down at a point in which the weeds are actually quite small, and to put it down thick enough that it's actually going to suppress the weeds. Because if you put it down thinly, the weeds are going to come up through, and then you're going to run into the issue of you're still going to have to go in and hand weed. And then also that it's not going to suppress persistent perennials. So things like thistles are just going to thrive in mulch. It cools the soil during the summer, retains moisture. That's really good. It can prevent soil-borne diseases like tomato blight that travel from the soil onto the leaves. If there's no splash from the rain hitting the soil onto the leaves of the plant, that can keep the diseases in the soil from transmitting to the plants. It obviously adds nutrients as they break down, so it builds organic matter over time. And I would say this is something that could be scaled up into a more of a multi-acre situation. There are ways to mechanize applying mulch. I actually have a small straw chopper that goes in the back of our tractor that runs off the PTO that we can actually chop small square bales and blow them out into the field. And I'll show you a picture of what that looks like on the next slide. And then natural mulches can be combined with other, synthetic mulches, landscape fabric, plastic mulches, and I'll show some pictures of that. So cons, I mentioned it's still going to require some hand weeding. For example, in our garlic, we always have to go in and hand weed at least once, even though we have it heavily mulched. And in particular, when you're using straw, it's very hard to find straw that's free of seed, that's free of oat seed generally, if it's oat straw. So you're going to get oats coming up in there, which may or may not be a problem depending on when they germinate and the crop that you have in there. Straw can also carry weed seed. Hay more likely can carry weed seed. So that's something to watch out for. It can interfere with subsequent cultivation and tillage. So unless you're leaving that mulch in place and just planting into the mulch, you might have a hard time actually tilling that into the soil or being able to cultivate that. If you have weed problems, it's just going to be in the way unless you rake it out of the way. And then I think one of the biggest things for me is the labor to apply it. And particularly the expense if you're purchasing it. And if you're not purchasing it and you're acquiring it free, is like, how are you acquiring sufficient amounts to actually use consistently? And then I'll just mention, it can be blown off by wind. This was actually an issue in Iowa. December 2021, we had a kind of little mini derecho, not like the one we had in August 2020, but we had 60, 70 mile an hour winds in December, no snow on the ground. A lot of producers lost straw, like the straw just was blown off the field that they had applied onto their garlic. So that's something that can happen if you get strong enough winds. And I know in South Dakota, you get as strong, if not stronger winds than we do in Iowa. So this is just showing you, I'll talk about landscape fabric, but this is landscape fabric with hay mulch in between. So kind of combining those two practices, you have that bare soil between the landscape fabric, and I'm covering that with the hay mulch. So I'm not using it across the whole bed. And then this is a garlic field in early April with that has actually had the straw blown on. So you can see how it's very uniform across the field. So this was not me like breaking up small square bales of straw and spreading them out by hand. I actually was just driving a tractor, and someone was loading the square bales into the chopper and then was holding a big tube, spraying this out onto the field. So that is a viable technique for mulching large areas with less labor. So now I'm going to turn to talking about plastic mulch, which has been a strategy that we've used quite a bit, I would say, in the last 2019 through 2022. It's been one of our main strategies for weed control. I always like this picture because this is actually a silver reflective mulch. So an aluminized plastic mulch that reflects the sky. And so it actually kind of looks almost like water under a blue sky. This mulch actually can blind you because the sun shines right off of it. And if you, let's say you're planting down the row and you have the sun in front of you, it will actually the sun will go up into your eyes, and it can be hard. You actually have to wear sunglasses or shade your eyes. So it's important to actually have the sun behind you and shading yourself when you're planting with this. And I'll talk a little bit about the reason for having the reflective mulch in a few slides. We lay this, let's see if I can actually get this video to work. Oh no, I may not be able to show videos. Oh, okay, good. I do have a few videos in here. So this is us laying that silver reflective mulch. I do have this mulch layer that actually was originally borrowed from a farmer in my neighborhood who doesn't really use it anymore. So I was able to just borrow it, and I've just kind of been fixing it up and improving it. I've added a second drip roller or a second holder for drip tape so that I can actually lay 2 lines of drip through the mulch or underneath the mulch. And this is pretty efficient. We can lay mulch fairly quickly with the tractor. I know there's farms that will actually lay mulch by hand, and I have done that before, and I find it to be it's more time consuming, but it's also just more strenuous on the body. So I really appreciate being able to do this with the tractor. And when we have good weed control with plastic mulch, it looks like this. Looks great, and this was actually this was weed control where we have the plastic mulch, and then we successfully controlled the weeds in the pathways using wheel hose, which I will talk about in a few slides or a little bit later in the presentation. So you can see on the right side of this, we've got some cucumbers and watermelons. So it was important for us to get those weeds controlled in the aisles between the plastic before those plants vined out. Because once they vined out, we weren't going to be able to control the weeds there. So we had to make sure to get that controlled with wheel hose. And then once the plant vines out onto the soil, it's going to effectively shade the soil and keep it fairly weed-free as long as there's no weeds there already. So this is an example of successful weed control with plastic mulch. There's various strategies for dealing with the space between the plastic mulch. You can use a wheel hoe, so just use hand tools to cultivate. You can put straw down or another natural mulch. You can put landscape fabric down between them, which is something we're going to actually start doing for some of our longer season crops this year. And then there's also tractor implements you can use that are specifically meant to cultivate the edges of plastic and the tire tracks between the plastic. But it's important to figure out what you're doing between the plastic beds. And this is examples of when we fail to figure out what we're doing between the plastic beds. You can have very intense weed pressure in between those. And while the crop itself is not being encroached on initially, eventually those weeds are going to get tall enough that they're going to shade out the crop in the plastic beds, or they're going to make harvest very difficult. They're going to make harvest just more unpleasant, scratchy, wet, weed seed clinging to your feet and to your pants. So figuring out what you're doing for weed control between plastic mulch is quite important. So it's not a cure-all. Plastic mulch has been very important for our farm because it's allowed us to continue farming in fields that have very intense weed pressure, as you can see, and to be able to get crops out of that area. But it doesn't mean that we have been able to just kind of, it hasn't made everything better. We still have weed problems that we have to control. So some of the pros and cons. Where the plastic is down, you get basically total weed control in the bed between the plants. Now, there's still a hole in the plastic where you're putting the plant in, and wherever there's a hole in the plastic, weeds can come up. So you can still have the issue of weeds coming up in every hole in the plastic where you have something planted, for example, with onions. And so it doesn't necessarily eliminate the need to weed the bed itself. You still might have to weed the crop itself, especially something like onions, which is slow growing and not competitive with weeds. So various types of mulch that you can use for different reasons. Black mulch is typically used for warming soil early. So you can lay that mulch like in April and warm the soil up. So you can maybe get an earlier crop of peppers or tomatoes or cucumbers or sweet potatoes. It's also good for late and overwintered plantings. I actually was using black plastic mulch for garlic and for overwintering onions and for some other late planted crops. White mulch can be used for cooling the soil for a summer planting. So if you're planting something like broccoli in the middle of the summer, you can use white mulch, which will actually help decrease the stress on that plant. And then you can use reflective and colored mulches for actually increasing photosynthesis and potentially yield, because the reflective mulch, for example, reflects light back up into the canopy of the plant. And the claim is that this actually allows the plant to do more photosynthesis and to have a larger leaf area, so it can actually improve yield. And I have seen some results with reflective mulch that I think have led me to believe that there is something to that. And then it also can have a pest deterrent quality. So particularly with aphids and flea beetles, the reflective mulch, by reflecting the light back up into the plant, can confuse insects that use light to navigate. And so it can actually help with a little bit of deterring pests from getting into your crops. It doesn't eliminate them completely. We'll have flea beetle problems, we'll still have aphids, but they won't be quite as bad with the reflective mulch, in my experience. It retains moisture in the same way that natural mulches do, which is great, especially we've had a number of dry years, and plastic mulch is great for actually retaining the moisture that we get from rain, but also if you're irrigating, like for example, we irrigate with drip irrigation underneath the plastic mulch, whatever you're irrigating is not evaporating as quickly. And it can prevent erosion during heavy rain events because the plastic's covering the soil and shedding the water. The water is still getting in under the mulch through the holes at the base of the plant. And it can shed water too. So like if we have a really heavy rain event and the soil won't be as waterlogged for as long. So it helps with both. It helps retain moisture, but it also can help keep the soil from getting too waterlogged. And then it keeps crops cleaner by preventing soil splash in the same way that natural mulches do. So the drawbacks, as I mentioned, there's the issue that you still have to hand weed. You still have to figure out what to do with the aisle between the plastics, the tire track, or the area between them. And this area can be difficult to cultivate with a wheel hoe or with a tractor. It's a kind of a challenging area because you don't want to rip into the plastic itself. The application obviously requires time. I think it's significantly less if you use a tractor. And honestly, the removal is the worst part because obviously you're not going to leave this plastic mulch in your soil long term. This is one-time use plastic. You might be able to get a second year out of it if it's not damaged, but generally you're removing this and disposing of it. So the labor of removal, the cost of disposing of it, the extra pass through the field that might be required to actually lift the mulch up. And I'll on the next slide, I'll show you an implement that I fashioned to kind of help with the removal process. There are actual implements that you can buy that are specifically for removing plastic mulch. The issue I've had with them is they tend to require rather high horsepower. So they're a little bit oversized for our tractor to actually be able to remove the plastic mulch that we can lay. We can easily lay it with our tractor, but it's harder to remove it with some of the implements that are available. It can create an environment for pests and rodents, particularly with sweet potatoes. I've noticed that you'll have mice and voles. You create a perfect little home for them under the plastic, and then they can chew on the tops of the sweet potatoes. And so you'll end up with sweet potatoes that have a lot of damage on top, which can also happen with bare soil, but I think it can be a little bit more prevalent with plastic because you've created that protected environment for them. And I mentioned the removal and disposal, the leftover pieces in the field. It's just, as much as you can be careful about trying to remove that plastic, you're going to end up with pieces that rip. And so I continue to find plastic in my soil, which I don't like, but we do our best to try to remove it. And then, of course, there is the ongoing issue with microplastics, where if you're putting plastic out in the field, that plastic is going to break down, it's going to tear, and small pieces of plastic are going to end up in your field. And I think there's a open question about how much of an issue that is, how much of a problem that is for human health going forward. I think in general, it's probably a good idea to see plastic mulch as more of a temporary practice. And that's how we've tried to see it on our farm, as something that's helping us grow right now, but it's not necessarily something we want to continue long-term, or we'd like to reduce our reliance on it over time. This is an implement I kind of came up with for, this is both for cultivating plastic, so cultivating the tire tracks and sort of the shoulders of the bed, and then also for removing it. So this is from Woodward Crossings, which is a company out of Pennsylvania, and they sell these toolbars that you can just kind of customize. They sell, I think they call it like the Wonder Bar, because you can just kind of do any configuration you want with this. And so you can put on discs, you can put on various sweeps. And so I've used this for like hilling potatoes or for making raised beds. But I'll also use this for helping to loosen the edges of the plastic so that we can then remove it. I've gotten away from using this for cultivation. It's not very effective at cultivation of plastic edges. It tends to damage the plastic, or it tends to bury the edges too much. So there actually are implements you can buy that are specifically for cultivating plastic. And those are worth looking into if you're going to kind of go more into this practice. I'll just bring up biodegradable mulches. We have experimented a little bit with biodegradable mulches. So these are mulches that are basically would be like a corn-based plastic that is compostable or will break down over time. So they look similar to a plastic mulch, but they do not necessarily need to be removed at the end of the year. So the nice thing is that you can lay them with the same tractor equipment, but you can leave them in place to decompose, which saves labor on disposal. They can add nutrients to the soil. Now, I'm not sure that the plastic ones do that so much, but there is a paper mulch that does actually would actually add some material to your soil, and some of those paper mulches are actually fortified with nutrients. So as they break down, they release nutrients. And I'm not sure that this actually addresses the microplastic issue, because I think there might be still an issue with the biodegradable plastic not fully breaking down and having some of the same issues as the petroleum-based plastic. The things that I found with the bioplastics is that they can break down too quickly, which can result in weeds coming up in your beds, or you can have difficulty removing them because they're breaking down. If you actually want to remove them from your soil, like for example, if you are concerned about having these plastics break down in your soil and you would rather remove them, then they're going to kind of be falling apart in your hands. They do tend to leave persistent remnants, from my experience, that don't completely break down. So I'm kind of not sold on the idea that they actually break down, or at least they have not in my soils. They're more expensive. They're about twice as expensive as the plastic. The paper mulch is about 10 times more expensive than the plastic. So I would love to use paper mulch, but I think the product is called Paper Guard is the main brand that you can buy, but it's just way more expensive than plastic, and it's hard to justify that. The bioplastics are a little bit more finicky to lay correctly. They're supposed to be laid loosely, and then they tighten through soil contact. So whereas the plastic mulch, you just kind of lay them as tight as you can. And then they're not as resistant to tearing during application, because they're a little bit, not the same as the petroleum-based plastics. So this is just to give you an example of this is the paper mulch. Actually, this is a farm in Wisconsin that I follow on Instagram. And I'll follow farms on Instagram, and I'll constantly screenshot things that they're doing to kind of remind me of practices that they're doing that I might want to research or look into. So this is one where they laid the paper mulch with a tractor, and then you can see they put landscape fabric down in between. So they have 100% coverage in this field, except for the place where the plant is poked through the paper mulch. So now we're going to talk about landscape fabric, which I think has become a more popular practice for mulching in the last few years. We kind of went all in on landscape fabric in 2017 as part of an attempt to kind of address some of our weed issues. So this is one of our attempts to address, our persistent weed issues. And we ended up buying a lot of 3-foot wide fabric that we laid across our beds, which our beds are 4 to 4.5 feet wide. So you can see there's a gap in between all of the fabrics. And this ended up being a real problem for us. We had a really hard time controlling the weeds between the landscape fabric, obviously. We did mulch. As I had a photo earlier that showed us mulching between there. We could use a wheel hoe between there, but it just was difficult to do that without hitting the landscape fabric itself. I would not recommend doing this. This was actually a pretty big failure for us. What I would recommend if you're going to use landscape fabric is to use wider landscape fabric and to overlap it. So now we've moved towards using 6-foot wide fabric, and we just overlap it in the aisles. And then we'll use that for a single season and remove it. Or we may actually, there's an area on the farm that we call our pick your own garden, which is for our CSA customers to come and pick flowers and herbs during their on-farm pickup. We actually have just left that down for 2 years in a row. So we don't really see a reason to remove it. And we just kind of pull the plants out of the holes in the fall or the spring, and then we replant into those holes. So you could actually have a permanent landscape fabric down that you use for your garden. But I think full coverage is really important with landscape fabric. And then the other way that we continue to use landscape fabric is we use it to cover aisles or pathways. And so we use it in our high tunnel. You can see we've got 3-foot fabric down in the high tunnel. And then between the fabric, we've got about 2 feet of space. And then in that 2 feet of space, we've got our row of tomatoes. This could be even tighter if you had slightly wider fabric. You could narrow up that space so that there's maybe only 6 inches of exposed soil. And then you've got your plants in there and you only have to weed that small seam. And I think next year we actually are switching to 4-foot fabric to cover more area. But that's another way to use fabric where you're not necessarily burning a hole in the fabric and planting into it, but you're planting your crop and then you're putting the fabric right up to the edge of the crop. So pros and cons for landscape fabric: removable, reusable, very durable. You could use landscape fabric for years and years. The woven landscape fabric in particular is very strong, UV treated, doesn't break down in sun. It can even be left in place for multiple years. Generally people use black, but there is white landscape fabric. So you can use it in similar ways as you would plastic mulch to get solar gain or to cool soil. Typically people are burning holes into the landscape fabric. So you have permanent hole spacing. So you have like a fabric that's 3 rows, 12 inches, which is nice because you have a planting template right there. As soon as you put the fabric down, your spacing is already set. I mentioned you can leave it in place. It's more expensive up front than plastic, but if you reuse it multiple years, I think it's probably comparable in price if you continue to use that plastic. It does allow, the woven does allow water and air through, so it's not completely impermeable like the black plastic or the disposable plastic is, but it does exclude light so weeds can't get through. And again, I think, less microplastics in the soil. I think there's still an issue of maybe the abrasion of the soil against the landscape fabric might still be putting some plastic into the soil, or the fabric itself fraying can put plastic in the soil. So I'm not sure if it's actually addressing the microplastic issue, but it's certainly addressing the one-time use disposal issue. Some of the cons with landscape fabric, I mean, you have to burn a hole in them if you're going to do that. And when you do, you have to burn kind of a wider hole than you would for disposable plastic, which means you have a wider area where weeds can come up through. So we've had issues with those kind of wider planting holes still letting a lot of weeds through. The black fabric can get hot during the summer and you can have some issues there. The labor to lay it is greater than plastic because typically you're not doing this with a tractor, you're doing this by hand. You could lay a new roll out with a tractor, but then once you're rolling it up by hand, it's not tight enough to be able to put back on the tractor to roll out again with the tractor. So you could lay it out once with the tractor, but then you got to do it by hand. We've tended to just lay it by hand because we use ground staples to actually secure it. So it requires a lot of ground staples to secure. I mean, we're putting staples every 4 feet, sometimes more frequently. And conditions need to be relatively calm to lay it, to get it tight so it's not billowing. And even then you can still have issues with it blowing away. So it can be a tough practice for people who are in very windy areas. One other thing I'll point out is if you leave it in place for a long period of time, like over the course of a season or multiple seasons, you're going to get encroachment of plants onto the edges of that. And then the plants are going to decompose and they'll actually just start to form soil right on top of your landscape fabric. And then you're going to have things growing in that soil. So if you leave landscape fabric over time, eventually it's just going to kind of become part of the soil and get buried. And then you're still going to have weeds coming up and it's going to kind of defeat the purpose. We've tried to use it as an edge fabric. You know, there's always the issue on vegetable farms where you have lots of edges that tend to get weedy, that either don't get mowed or weed whacked or cultivated. So we tried putting landscape fabric down on all those edges, and all it did was just create a new edge that was difficult to mow and to weed whack, because now we had to avoid hitting the landscape fabric. So I've had issues with hitting the landscape fabric with a rototiller or a mower and having to get tangled up in the blades and having to extract it, which is not something you want to be doing in the middle of the growing season. And then there's another issue with, is there a pest or disease carryover when you're reusing this fabric from year to year? You're pulling the fabric out of the field. You just had tomato plants on there. Maybe some of the tomato foliage and soil is stuck on the fabric. Is that going to then carry over to your subsequent crop? So it's important to think about when you're using landscape fabric, like what crop am I going to use it on the following year? Is it going to carry over disease? This is just to show you, there's a farm in State Center, Iowa called Minerva's Meadow, which is a flower farm. And Dan Filius is the account here, Iowa Veg Pro Support. He works for Iowa State Extension, and he visits farms and he does great Instagram stories about, their practices. And he just pointed out Minerva's Meadow uses these extremely long sod staples, we use 8-inch staples. They use 12 to 18-inch staples to actually hold their fabric down in very windy conditions. And you can see they also use this piece of plastic to help with tearing, which can be an issue where the fabric will move up and down against the staple and then will eventually just tear. And so then the fabric will come out because it's not secured to the staple anymore. I don't know where these plastic pieces are from, but that's another option for, if you're in a really windy area and you're having difficulty with using landscape fabric. We got a couple videos here to show you. This is a farm in British Columbia who ingeniously created this a way to roll their landscape fabric back up using their tractor. So this was a custom built implement that's hooked up to their tractor and allows them to roll the fabric back up with a minimum of effort and into a very tight roll that they can then reuse on their tractor. So this is them reusing, this is an already used roll of landscape fabric that they've rolled up using that implement, and now they're reapplying it with their mulch layer. So this is really interesting. I mean, this is a custom built piece of machinery. This is not something that you can buy, but I found this really interesting, and I'm kind of curious if some of us growers in Iowa might be able to go in on this together and maybe try to build this machine and then share it, because this would make landscape fabric a lot more viable, especially for farms that are a little bit larger scale. And then one other thing I'll show is this is a farm in Wisconsin that I actually had the pleasure of visiting last July, Red Door Family Farm. And they actually came up with this way of re-rolling their landscape fabric that is by hand, but it also includes a bath of sanitizer. So they have a galvanized stock tank there that they have water with sanitizer in it. So this addresses the issue of disease carryover that I mentioned. If you can wash your landscape fabric as you're rolling it up, you can prevent some of that disease carryover. So that's just some ideas of things I've seen from other growers that help make landscape fabric a more viable practice. Okay. I think I'm a little bit behind for finishing, so I might speed up a little bit. Tarps are a practice for basically killing weeds by excluding light. And so you can lay a tarp down and either you have existing vegetation that will kill that, or you have weeds that are going to germinate and then die because there's no light. So you can see tarp on the left with all the weights that we use to hold them down in the wind. And then on the right is after we remove the tarp. So you can see it's just bare soil, nice, completely weed free for the time being. And this just kind of shows what happens to plants when you put the tarp down over them. They elongate and they get yellow because they can't photosynthesize, and then eventually they die. So you need to leave the tarp down for a certain period of time to kill those weeds, 1-2 weeks. For perennials, you need to leave them down for much longer. You can kill thistles, quackgrass, sod, but you need to leave the tarp down for months, not weeks. And this is just an example of, often these silage tarps, generally there are silage tarps that you're buying. So they're very thick, large pieces of plastic. They're UV treated. So they're very, they're durable and they don't break down in the sun, but they can be hard to lug around. And so I kind of came up with this hack of just, putting a chain around the bucket of my tractor, and I can drag the tarp around. If you have a couple people, it's pretty easy just to move it around with 3 people, but especially if you're by yourself, this can be a way to move tarps around with a little less effort. So as I mentioned, UV treated, durable, you can leave them in the field. They tend to kill anything underneath them, depending on how long you put them. They work well with no-till in the sense that you can kill weeds and take care of the residue from the prior crop without tilling. It's a good way to kind of put things on hold for a while. You just put the tarp down, nothing's growing there. You don't have to worry about that area. And it can also help weed seed from blowing into a plot. There's a bunch of cons with tarps, which I don't know. I want to go and get into all of them, but I can talk more about tarps at the end if people are interested, if they have specific questions, or I can revisit the slide. But I do have a lot to say about them. They're a practice that we continue to use, but I do think they're not a very scalable practice, and I do think there might be alternatives that would work just as well, if not better. Just to touch on no-till, the no-till techniques that we've used on the farm, we use a deep compost mulch. So you can see that we're laying a thick layer of compost on top of bare soil, and that compost is effectively serving as a mulch. So this is kind of a no-till practice that, you could do this with leaves or with straw, but the compost itself is adding a lot of nutrients to the soil at the same time, a lot of immediate nutrients to the soil. So this is a way of building up soil quite quickly. And then we're just planting our transplants or direct seeding directly into that compost mulch. We continue to use this technique in our high tunnel. So our high tunnel is completely no-till, and we prep it no-till in our transitions between crops. We use a broad fork to help alleviate compaction, and then we'll use the wheel hoe typically to break up the surface of the soil. So it's kind of a form of minimal tillage, not like a rototiller. And then we'll lay compost on top of that and smooth the compost out. And that's generally the sequence that we use to build a no-till bed. I've attempted to use cover crops as a no-till technique. This was winter rye that I mowed to kill it. So the rye was at antithesis or I won't even try. The rye was heading out and producing seed, at which point you can mow it to kill it. And so once it's killed, I just went ahead and transplanted right into it. The problem was that I didn't use any supplemental nutrition or any fertilizers or compost. And so the plants looked good for a few weeks, and then they just ended up very stunted. They just didn't have enough nutrients. And there was also an issue with rye can interfere with crop growth of a subsequent crop. So this is not something I've tried again, but this is kind of more scaled up organic no-till is usually using cover crops rather than compost mulch. This is something we did last year where I grew oats and field peas in this area. And then I mowed it to kill it. And then we laid compost mulch over the top of it. And then we planted into that. So this is kind of a hybrid of those two techniques. And it was reasonably successful. We still had to cultivate, and the cultivation was, rather difficult, especially in those pathways where there was a lot of residue. But this worked pretty well. We had pretty good crop health. It took a lot of time to prepare. And that is kind of my biggest issue with no-till is the extra labor it takes to prep beds. And then especially if you're buying compost, the expense of the compost. And I found it particularly hard to do when I have a narrow planting window. So, I might have only 1 day or 8 hours, before a rainstorm to go and plant a bunch of beds. And if I have to prep all of them by hand and I can't just go and rototill them quickly, I may not be able to get a crop planted. So in a lot of ways, I've had to, a number of instances, I've had to just abandon doing no-till because I just didn't have the time. And it was more important for me to get the crop in than to kind of preserve the no-till. But there are a lot of benefits to it, and particularly in regards to weeds. If you're not tilling your soil, you're not bringing up new weed seed. So eventually you can start to deplete the weed seed bank in the top 2 inches of your soil, and then you're not bringing up more weed seed. So I think over time, no-till can actually deal with some of these persistent weed issues, but you have to be able to get through what I call the transition years, which can be difficult. And then also, it is more labor intensive. So you have to be at a scale where that works for you, or that works with your disposition. And I've just found at our scale, with our kind of time constraints, no-till, except for the high tunnel, where I think it works well for us in the high tunnel, I've not found it to be a practice that we've been able to implement across the farm. The other farm that we did our SARE grant with actually is converting their entire 2 acres to no-till. So that's just to say that a practice that works on one farm or doesn't work on one farm may work great on another farm. Cover crops, I'll just kind of run through these slides quickly that just show various cover crops on our farm. The main ones that we use for spring, we use oats and field peas. That's something we might plant like first thing in the spring before we plant something in like May or June, a cash crop. In the summer, we love buckwheat, where you can plant that between a spring and a fall crop or after a spring crop. It grows very quickly. It doesn't need water. It outcompetes weeds. And then in the fall, we like winter rye. Winter rye you can plant anytime from August through December. It will survive any condition during the winter. Even if it doesn't germinate in the fall, it will germinate early the next spring. So it's truly the most cold hardy cover crop you can grow. And so cover crops, what they do for weeds is they can suppress weed germination. The cover crop is growing, it's keeping the weeds from germinating, or it's competing with the weeds where it's growing faster than the weeds, and so the weeds aren't able to be competitive. And you can break up weed cycles that way. There's also the practice of using sorghum Sudan grass, which is a very tall, aggressive grass for actually dealing with thistles. So you can plant that in a field with thistles. The sorghum Sudan grass will get 6, 7, 8 feet tall. The thistles are way down below, getting shaded out. And then maybe you mow that a few times, and you cause the thistles to expend a lot of energy, and maybe eventually the thistles tire out and die if you do that practice long enough. There's various issues with cover crops. I think all of them are surmountable, but they're ones that have to be dealt with. We use cover crops on the farm. We should use them more. I think the most important advice I could give with cover crops is you need to prioritize them in the same way that you would prioritize your cash crops. Because if you don't, they're just not going to get planted. And that's something that I'm still trying to implement on our farm in terms of really having that mindset. But I think it's important to think about that, because if the cover crops are always second fiddle, you're never going to have enough time to get them planted. Okay, let's talk about shallow soil disturbance, so cultivation. The photo on the left, you can see that's kind of a photo that screams to me too late, in that we're a few weeks behind, or a week behind on that field. We've got a lot of seeds that have germinated. Now, we obviously still go in there and cultivate and kill those weeds, depending on the tools we use. But the photo on the right, that does have a lot of seeds germinated, but you can also see there's a lot of little white threads in that soil. That's the white thread stage of the weed. And so the white thread stage is when the weed seed has germinated, but it has not emerged yet. And that's when weed seed is the most vulnerable. That is the absolute key time to cultivate and to try to kill weeds. So it's before you even see weeds when you need to be cultivating. And so that highlights the importance of going out into the field, scratching into the soil, looking to see if the weed seed is germinating in the soil, rather than just waiting for the weeds to appear. Because at the point that the weeds appear, you're already behind. So early and often is kind of the mantra with cultivation. And someone this summer who came and visited my farm, another farmer, said, there's the difference between cultivation and weeding is when you're cultivating, you're cultivating soil before you even see weeds. Weeding is when you're trying to kill weeds that have already emerged. And so you want to be cultivating and not weeding. So killing them after germination, but before emergence that's the critical window for killing weeds, when you can most effectively kill weeds, when they're the most vulnerable. Shallow is important. The top 2 inches of the soil is where most of the weed seeds are. So if you disturb the soil below that using your cultivation technique, you're just going to bring up more weed seed. And then in a couple of weeks, you're going to be right back at square one. As close to the row as possible without disturbing the crop. So leaving as little soil undisturbed as you can. A general principle that I learned this summer is when the crop is young, you want to pull soil away from the crop with your cultivation action, and then as the crop matures, you want to throw soil back into the row to help bury the weeds in the row. So mostly for cultivation, we've used wheel hoes. So wheel hoes are basically they're similar to like a stirrup hoe. They're just a sharpened U-shaped blade, various widths, anywhere from 5 inches to 18 inches. And they have an oscillating action, 2 handles, 1 or 2 wheels, and you push them through the soil, going back and forth. And wheel hoes have been really versatile for us. They allow us to weed at many different stages, all the way from that white thread stage to, weeds that are almost, bigger than the crop. We use both single blade wheel hoes, like the one on the right. The one on the left, which you can't see very well, is a double wheel hoe or a straddle wheel hoe. And that we can actually go over the row and it will cultivate on both sides of the row. So wheel hoes have been, kind of, I would say, our most important weeding tool up to this point. They're easy and ergonomic to use. It doesn't require a lot of effort as long as you're not digging in too deeply and as long as you're not allowing the weeds to get too big. If you have a lot of large weeds to deal with, it is going to be hard to wheel hoe. They're way faster and less effort than any type of hand hoeing. And the thing I love about them is they can kill weeds at many different stages. So anywhere from rescuing a planting that's getting overwhelmed to cultivating during that white thread stage. The main drawbacks that we found is you're not getting that in-row weed control. So you're still going to have to hand weed or figure out something to do for that in-row. And you're just not able to cover as much ground as a mechanical cultivator, which is what we're moving towards and what I'm going to talk about next. And that's especially true for us in the heat of summer. June, July, August, we regularly have temperatures 80s, 90s, heat indexes in the 90s and even 100. It's really hard to send people out to wheel hoe in that kind of heat. And it's much better to be able to sit in a tractor seat or walk behind a tractor than actually have to expend effort wheel hoeing. So that's kind of one of the main reasons that we're getting away from wheel hoeing, is we just find that we can't cover the amount of ground that we need to cover to get everything cultivated in a timely manner. So I'm going to end kind of by talking about walk behind tractor and 4-wheel tractor cultivation. I just purchased a Planet Junior tractor, which I'm going to be setting up this winter for cultivating. So the main thing with 2-wheel tractor cultivation is some of you may have BCS or a Griot, which is a type of walk behind tractor. Those are not built for cultivation. So they're just not a good tractor for cultivating. There are brands of tractors, of walk behind tractors, that are specifically built for cultivation. The two that I'll bring up in particular are Planet Junior and David Bradley. And these are brands that were produced mid-century. They're no longer produced, so they're all used, but they were mass produced. So there's lots of them out there, and they also are beloved and people collect them. And so many of them are still in circulation. And often they just slap a new engine on it, and then you've got all the original, new wheels, new engine, and then it's the original body and tooling. There also is a company called Tilmore, which produces something called the Power Rocks, which is basically a brand new 2-wheel cultivating tractor that is kind of modeled off of the Planet Junior. And so you can use all the same implements, like anything that works on a Planet Junior will work on a Tilmore Power Rocks and vice versa. So you can buy them new. They're about, $3,000 to $4,000 to buy the tractor plus get set up with tooling. With a Planet Junior or a David Bradley, it's kind of closer to $1,000 to buy the tractor and get set up with tooling. So it's a little bit cheaper to start with a Planet Junior. I'd highly recommend the Facebook groups Gardening for Market and Planet Junior Farming. I think that's Plant Junior, but it's actually Planet Junior. Those are both places to learn about 2-wheel tractor cultivation. There's some really experienced people in those groups who are really happy to help beginners and get people set up. And then you can also find them used as well. I'd be curious to hear from people afterward about whether there are people in South Dakota who are using 2-wheel tractors, or this is a practice that is, that about, or people who do it. So I went to a field day in Wisconsin where I got to use a Planet Junior. This is my friend Kate, who farms in Ames, Iowa. This is her using a 3-row setup. So she's cultivating 3 rows at once of radishes. So that just gives you an idea of what that looks like. They're pretty fast. There's no way to adjust the speed on these. They basically, you just put them in the gear and they're in gear. And I mentioned in an earlier slide that usually you only cultivate as many rows as you plant at one time. So if you're planting 1 row at a time, you'd want to cultivate 1 row at a time, because otherwise it's going to be very difficult not to take out some of your rows. But these rows are actually planted all at the same time, so they're all parallel to each other. So it actually is possible to cultivate them all at the same time. I'll also just mention 4-wheel tractor cultivation. I was able to use a Tillmore cultivating tractor this field day. That's me with Kat Becker, who's the farmer, showing me how to use this. And I'll just briefly mention there's various types of 4-wheel tractor cultivation. There's tractors where you have a belly mounted cultivator that you actually can look down while you're steering. So you're steering and you're looking at the implement. There's blind cultivation, which is where you have it on the back of a 3-point and you're just driving, trying to drive straight. You know, you can look back at the implement, but the more you look back, the less straight you're going to drive. And then there are steerable implements where you can actually put them on the back of your tractor, and then someone on the back is steering the implement to actually do the cultivation. And then also mention, you know, with 4-wheel tractor cultivation, you've got tractors and implements that you can actually cultivate in the bed. And then you've got implements that are just for cultivating like tire tracks and the edges of plastic. So I'll just briefly show you, this is the Tillmore tractor that I got to try out at the field day. This would be for like cultivating. This is obviously a bare soil bed, but this is kind of something you would use to cultivate the edges of a plastic bed. So you can see it has those 2 kind of spider wheels on it that are cultivating the edge. And then you've got the A sweeps, or the flat sweeps, that are cultivating the tire track. An implement that I'm hoping to invest in for this spring is a tine weeder. So this is a type of blind cultivation tool. I currently only have tractors they're not cultivating tractors. They just have 3-point mounts. So I can't use a belly mounted implement. So I'm kind of limited to things that are blind cultivation. And so the way this works is it has all these metal tines, and they just scrape through the soil. And they're really effective when the weeds are at that white thread stage. You know, if the weeds are established, this is not really going to do anything. It's just going to scrape over the top of them, and they're not going to get weeded. But if you've got a lot of weeds that are just germinating, this tine weeder is going to rip those all out of the soil. And you can use this on bare soil. You can use it on a crop. As long as the crop is actually established and rooted into the soil, the tine weeder won't rip the crop out, but it will kill the weeds. Just briefly about stale or false seed bedding. Basically, the idea is you prepare the soil as if you're going to plant, but you don't plant. You let the weeds germinate, you shallowly cultivate, so that you don't bring up more weed seed, and then you plant your crop. So you basically have killed a generation of weeds prior to putting the crop in. And something I learned this winter was that there was a study done in Kentucky, and they found that after the first pass, 42% of the weeds were killed in the top 2 inches of the soil. But the second pass, significantly more were killed, over 90%. So doing 2 passes, about 7 to 10 days apart, is actually way more effective than doing a single pass. This was actually the implement that they used in that study in Kentucky. So this is like specifically for stale seed bedding, but you can use lots of different implements to do this. You could use a basket weeder, you could use a cultivator, a tine weeder, a power harrow, which is more shallow cultivation, a rototiller if it has a depth roller or a gauge wheel so that it doesn't go too deep. You can use tarps to do this. Although the issue with tarp is that a lot of weeds need light to germinate. So when you pull the tarp off, weeds are going to germinate because you just introduce light. That's kind of a drawback with tarps. And then flame weeding is another way to do this, which we've actually used on the farm, where you use a propane torch to basically let the weeds germinate, and then you go through and torch them off. We use this with carrots. So carrots are slow to germinate. We plant our carrots, the weeds come up first, we torch off the weeds, and then the carrots emerge. The timing is really critical here. You have to do it before your carrots come up, but after the weeds come up. And this works really well for broadleaf weeds. It's not very good for grasses. Just going through, we do, these are pictures I'm not necessarily proud of. Like, this is us rescue weeding our onion crop, which we seemingly did every year for many years. And it was just always a question of, is it worth it or not? And sometimes it was, and wasn't. And with, for example, with carrots, obviously that's a very weedy carrot bed, not ideal at all. But generally, even on farms where they have very effective weed control, they do still have to hand weed carrots. It's just one of those crops where you just can't, there just isn't a way to get effective enough weed control where you're not going to have to at least do one pass through hand weeding. I think onions might be another crop that's like that. So hand weeding can be part of an effective weed control system. But if your only way of controlling weeds is hand weeding, then that's kind of a problem. You haven't set up your system properly if you're always having to rely on hand weeding. And then I'll just say sometimes we let weeds get away from us and we just have to weed whack. And I've rescued crops where we let the weeds grow up in the aisles and I went in and weed whacked, and the weeds were mature enough that they basically were killed by the weed whacker. And then the crop was still okay and it was able to grow and mature. We did this with Brussels sprouts this year. Had weeds that were as tall as the Brussels sprouts. We weed backed them. It was not a fun job, but the weeds didn't come back and we got a great Brussels sprout crop. So that's not necessarily what we planned on, but it is, it is a viable strategy of being able to salvage a planting. So I apologize for having to run through the end of that presentation. I do want to leave time for questions. And here's my information if you want to look me up or contact me. So yeah, at this point, I'm happy to take questions. So I'm just going to look through the ones that are here.
And I'll jump in with a reminder to fill out the survey, the evaluation survey.
Okay, I'm going to kind of jump around questions and maybe answer some of the ones that are a little bit easier. Sean asked, do you find mulching your alleys in between raised beds makes it easier to walk on them during rains? Yes, I didn't mention that, but that's actually a big benefit to mulching, is that you can walk on the soil and you're not compacting the soil as much. And also you're not getting muddy. And so actually that's a big benefit, especially in areas where you have to transit and harvest a lot, like peppers, tomatoes, zucchini, cucumbers, where you might be going in there and harvesting like 2-3 times a week. It's really great to have that mulch down to protect the soil and to keep things cleaner for you and potentially your crew. Recommended mulch depth, Tess asks. I would say it depends, because the mulch is going to settle. So I think sometimes you're kind of mulching, like with straw, I'm mulching like 3-4 inches, and I know that's going to settle down into maybe 2 inches. I generally think you want it thick enough that you can't see the soil. That was kind of our rule of thumb with compost, that we wanted the compost down thick enough that we couldn't see the soil. Because if we can't see the soil, then that is kind of a good proxy for like, is there light getting through that weeds can use to grow? Charles asks, opinion on using pine straw as mulch. My understanding is that's fine. I think there's maybe been some overblown concerns about acidifying soil using pine mulch. I don't think that's an issue unless you already have very acidic soil. In a lot of places, acidifying the soil is a good thing, especially if your pH is like neutral or a little bit basic. So I think pine needles can work fine as a mulch, but you'd want to evaluate that over time. It's good to test your soil to see what the pH is and to see if the pH is being changed by doing that. Vance mentions that him and his wife use a strategy where they use grass clippings. They lay it thick around the plants. And then go back to that question.
Sorry about that.
No, that's okay. Break down nutrients. Yeah, that's an effective strategy. I think grass clippings work great. I've seen a lot of gardens that use grass clippings very effectively. I found on my scale, 2 to 3 acres, that we just can't collect enough clippings. It's just too much labor. But on a garden scale, I think it's a great practice, especially if you can collect your own clippings and it's not too onerous to, if you have a mulching mower that, shoots them into a bag and then you can just empty the bag out. Yeah, especially if you can know the origin of where those clippings are come from, I think it's a great practice. I've used red mulch around my small tomato garden with good success. It prevents rain from splashing up on tomatoes and eliminates blossom end rot. Yeah, I've heard good things about red mulch in particular for tomatoes. You can look up recommendations with those different colored mulches. They kind of match to the crop, as in like this color mulch is good for this crop. So yeah, there's ways of using plastic mulch to not only have all those benefits of weed control, but also even improve the yield of the crop.
One thing we found with red mulch, it seemed like grass grew underneath it pretty well.
Oh, interesting. Yeah. So I think, yeah, that's interesting because that can be an issue with white mulch as well, but it's got to be white on black. So like the mulch I use is actually white on one side and black on the other. So yeah, if you don't have that black opaque layer in the plastic, then yeah, you can still get weed growth. So like anytime you're using a colored mulch, I've actually not used colored mulch, so I don't know if this exists, but I would assume the best ones would have some sort of opaque layer. So they've got the red on top, and then they've got an opaque layer underneath, so you don't get grass growing or weeds growing. It mentions red plastic, but it's expensive. Do you have a source for your plastic? I use Nolt's Produce Supply in Charles City, Iowa, and I highly recommend them. You all wouldn't be too far from them. They're the cheapest around, and they're really quick with their shipping. So it's really hard to find a cheaper source for a lot of irrigation equipment, plastics, tools, harvest bins. Highly recommend them. They are not online. You have to get a catalog. So you have to look them up online, get their number, and then get their catalog, and you call in to place your order. With a solid color landscape fabric, do you have a solarization issue? I'm not sure I understand that question completely.
I wonder if it's heat buildup they're concerned with.
Yeah, I think that can be an issue depending on the crop. That can be obviously be desirable with any warm season crop: cucumbers, zucchini, tomatoes, peppers. Now, if you're using it with kale or lettuce, I think it can be more of an issue. I think there have been studies that have shown that landscape fabric does not necessarily increase soil temperatures in the way that maybe it's purported to, that it actually maybe even cools the soil a little bit by reflecting the sun away. So I think the issues I see more with landscape fabric is like the landscape fabric itself gets hot, and then that can hurt the plants rather than it actually heating up the soil a ton. That's kind of been my experience with it. If you leave landscape fabric on for multiple seasons, are you not seeing loss of organic matter in your soil or soil texture becoming more clay? Yeah, I think that's potentially an issue. I mean, obviously you still have plants growing in there. And so the plants, the root mass from those plants is still going down through the landscape fabric, so there's still, organic matter being added that way. We actually, at the end of the season, we pulled all the plants up, or this was in the spring the following year. And then we had a lot of soil that ended up on the surface, and we just took a broom and swept the soil back into the holes. And then it was funny because actually we had a lot of rabbit droppings from rabbits moving on that landscape fabric, and we just swept that into the holes, and it basically was like we amended the holes. So I do see there being compaction issues over time, because if you're walking on top of the landscape fabric, if you're not controlling your traffic on that landscape fabric, you can end up with compaction that's not as obvious because you've got it covered in landscape fabric. So yeah, I don't necessarily recommend putting landscape fabric down for multiple seasons. We only do that in that one garden area, and in general we like to move it, to pull it up and move it every year. And I think that's good. I think it's good to rotate that through, maybe use landscape fabric one year and then have it be bare soil, so you don't run into the issues that you're mentioning. Justine asks, what organic fertilizers work best for you, granular and liquid, and how do you apply? I've had pretty good luck with, we obviously use compost, but we also use a couple different things. Ohio Earth Supply in Wisconsin, they have a product called Revita, and we will use the high nitrogen version of that. So it's like, I've used a couple different kinds, but it's like an 823, something like that. I've even used one that's like 16 for nitrogen. We tend to have a lot of phosphorus and potassium in our soil, and so we're looking more for just high nitrogen. We don't want to over apply phosphorus and potassium. And that's nice because it's basically like a pelletized chicken manure. So it's granular, it's easy to apply, but it also has some they put some kelp and some biological inoculants in that. So it has nice biology in it. We also do liquid foliar feed, and we use liquid micronutrients in particular, like boron, which is something that we're short of in our soil. So I would recommend those things like kelp and fish emulsion can be really, really great as a liquid foliar feed. And I'll also just mention the Neversink blend from Seven Farm Supply in Virginia. You don't necessarily need to buy it from them, but I would go look it up and see what's in it. It's a nice comprehensive all-purpose fertilizer that I like using in our beds, like our intensive beds where we grow like greens and things like that. And I actually will buy all the ingredients from a closer supplier and then mix them myself. Although you can buy it already mixed from 7 Farm Supply. But those would be the two that I would recommend looking into as organic fertilizers that I've used and felt like that I've been fairly successful with. Do you make your own compost? If not, how do you trust the source you get it from to maintain your organic status? I do make my own compost, and that we have a compost pile, but my issue is that we don't do hot composting. It's much more of a passive pile. So I can't trust that it doesn't have disease carryover or weeds in it. And I've been burned before of using that compost and having weed issues. So I don't use that compost in our annual vegetable fields. I will use it in other situations like mulching perennials. So we do buy compost, and it's from certified organic sources. So we bought from Cowsmo in Wisconsin. We've bought from Purple Cow. But yeah, it's an issue because there actually is no good certified organic compost producer in Iowa. So I have to get it from out of state, and the trucking costs as much as the compost, which is one of the reasons why I'm moving a little bit away from, doing that no-till compost intensive system, because it's just quite expensive. It ends up being about $50 worth of compost per season for that no-till bed, which, if you're producing a couple crops off that bed and grossing, over $1,000, that it's a reasonable expense, but once you factor in the labor and so on. So yeah, I get it from certified organic sources. So that's how I have some assurance that that it works with my certified naturally grown certification, and then also that I'm assured that it's not introducing heavy metals or persistent pesticides into my soil. Eric says Montgomery Wards had 2-wheel tractors too. Okay, I don't know if those are new 2-wheel tractors or older ones. There are a few other brands that I didn't mention besides the David Bradley and Planet Junior, but those are the kind of the most prominent ones that I see for cultivating tractors. Kyle says there are some interesting autonomous robotic weeding technologies that have been advancing, obviously mostly for large scale because of cost, but some are starting to develop smaller scale solutions. Nayo is one of the interesting companies I can remember. Wouldn't that be the solution to all of our weeding challenges? Yeah, I think there is some interesting stuff happening with robotics with weed control. I've seen robots that actually, spray herbicide. They have a camera that recognizes the crop, and then they'll spray herbicide. And then there's obviously ones that will use cultivating tools or even electricity. And yeah, I think those are probably more viable at a larger scale given the cost of those robots. So I don't see those being very viable for smaller scale production anytime soon. But yeah, I mean, I would, as long as that technology can be controlled by the farmers themselves, I wouldn't necessarily be opposed to that kind of thing being used, especially if it lessens our labor. If it actually lessens, our burden as farmers, then I'm not opposed to that at all. Do I use molasses in the garden? I don't. I know people who do. As I mentioned, the foliar feeds that we tend to use are like fish emulsions and various micronutrients. I've used products from a company called Advancing Eco Ag, which is John Kemp's company. And I use that particularly because of they have some good products for micronutrients that I find deficient in our soil. We have very heavy clay soil, which tends to be very tight in the sense that it holds on to nutrients very tightly. So if you amend the soil, even if you amend the soil with the nutrients that your soil test says you're short on, those nutrients may not be available to the plants themselves because the plants can't get those ions out of the soil because the soils are tight. So part of the way to mitigate that is to, build up your organic matter, build up your biological activity, because that helps free up the nutrients. But also in the meantime, you can foliar feed, which is a more immediate way to get those nutrients to your plants. So I highly recommend testing your soil and testing it for micronutrients. And then if you're short on any micronutrients, figuring out how to amend your soil to put those micronutrients back into the soil, and also maybe to find a way to foliar feed to get those nutrients to the plant. Micronutrients are really important, not only for yield, but just for overall plant health, and that particularly a lot of disease issues can be traced back to micronutrient deficiencies. And there's other issues, like, for example, if you ever have carrots that are split, that can be a water issue, but it can also be a boron issue. If you cut open a broccoli stalk and the broccoli stalk is hollow, That can be a boron issue. So micronutrients kind of mediate some of the functions of plants. And so if you address those issues, you can start to address some of the underlying causes for some pests, some disease, and even pest issues. And as I mentioned, building your soil over time and amending those micronutrient issues means you're going to have healthier crops, which are going to compete better with weeds, but also they may actually change the composition of your soil to the extent that it may actually change the kind of weeds that you have. It may even eliminate certain weed problems. For example, something like dandelions, those grow in soils that are very tight and compacted and tend to be low in calcium. So there's areas of the farm where I used to have dandelion issues and then I don't anymore. And I largely chalk that up to not me like killing the dandelions off, but me changing the composition of the soil to the extent that the dandelions just didn't thrive in there anymore. And now I have a new set of weeds to deal with, but it's a different set and maybe a potentially less challenging set of weeds. So.
Jordan, you had asked a question about our folks using Tillmore, and Rhoda, weigh in if you've seen this on other farms as well. I know our presenter next Tuesday, Peggy, I know she has both a 2 and a 4-wheel. Well, she has the 2-wheel Tillmore, and then I think she has some of their attachments for their tractor as well. So
okay, cool. Yeah.
I can share at least one person. So if folks have more curiosities about Tillmore, there would be a great chance to ask Peggy Martin some questions next Tuesday evening.
Great. Yeah. And I recommend those Facebook groups too, for if you want to learn about the Planet Juniors, and some of the peoples on that Facebook group have YouTube videos too that are really extensive. Actually, just if you search on YouTube for like Planet Junior or 2-wheel tractor cultivation, there's tons of videos showing you the different toolings, different setups for 2-wheel tractors. Yeah.
Rhoda, did you want to, I know you had a curiosity about landscape fabric with the cleaning system. Do you want to bring that up if anyone else has a question for Jordan, please drop it in the chat. But Rhoda, I'm going to let you bring that up.
I was just curious where they were cleaning the landscape fabric as they rolled it up. If their cleaning solution was strong enough, or by overwintering for months, did they end up with a sort of matted bacteria fungal mass by the time they got
that's a good question, and that would be a good question for them. I honestly just someone pointed me to that video a couple weeks ago, and so I decided to share it. I'd seen farms doing similar things, but that's a good question because I don't know what they're using. They are an organic farm, so I imagine they're using something like Sanadit or Tsunami, which is like a hydrogen peroxide, which is something that I use for washing greens. So I don't know if that's strong enough. I mean, because actually for greens, they're supposed to be exposed to that for 45 seconds, I believe. So yeah, they may be moving it way too quickly for it actually to be doing anything. So that's a great point. I don't actually know, but they would be the better people to answer that, because they may have thought through that and would have a better response. But
I'm sure if it happened once, they'd know not do it again.
Yeah, and I don't know how much of that is like
in there.
Yeah, well, I also thought about it going through the water and then you're rolling it up. It is just going to be like really like moldy, or end up being like moldy or sticky because it doesn't have a chance to dry out at all, or it's coming out so wet. But I mean, they've had a chance to use it for a few seasons, so they probably have figured out whether that's the case. And I don't know how much that's prophylactic for them, is that they're just trying to take care of problems before they see them, or if they've had a particular problem and they're trying to address that. I don't actually know.
Well, Jordan, you gave us so many wonderful ideas, and folks, I did try to drop as many links to things, people are like, wait, what was the name of that supplier?
Thank you so much for doing that. Yeah, I appreciate that.
And the great thing is a lot of what Jordan talked about tonight creates some nice through lines for us to continue our discussion next week. Next Tuesday evening, we're going to have Peggy Martin of Cedar Creek Garden and Kent Vleeger, who is a NRCS soil health specialist for the state of South Dakota. They're going to be talking specifically about managing soil health. But again, if folks are curious about the Tillmore, that would be a great place to ask. And we're going to be talking more about cover crops in landscape fabric and some of the lessons we learned this summer, as well as some supporting data on living mulch and living pathways and the use of landscape fabric. So we do look forward to having everyone join us again. Jordan, I did share a link to your SARE report as well, so that folks
Okay.
could see the in-depth nitty gritty on your SARE project. Are there other places that people could look for webinars or, content you've created through Practical Farmers of Iowa or anything like that?
Yeah, I think Practical Farmers of Iowa, we did a field day, a virtual field day about no-till. So that I think is available on the Practical Farmers of Iowa YouTube channel. That's both me and Hannah and Emily from Humble Hands Harvest. Yeah, that would be the most relevant to this presentation would be that one.
Well, wonderful. Jordan, we really appreciate you being with us tonight. And we've had some expressions of gratitude in the Q&A. And again, thank you everyone for giving us your feedback. We'll be sharing all of that with Jordan. So if you have more compliments that you want to drop, please do so in the survey. We'd love to see those and package them up for Jordan. Jordan, any parting advice or words, something you wish someone would have told you when you got started?
Don't let weeds go to seed. Whatever you do, don't let your weeds go to seed because you'll be paying for it later on. But I appreciate everyone coming, and I actually really enjoyed putting this presentation together. I was going back through a lot of old photos and putting them together. So it was fun for me to think through how my weed strategies have changed over the years and to kind of see some of the evolution on the farm. So I had never done a presentation about weed control in particular. So it was really fun to do this. So I appreciate the opportunity.
Awesome. Well, thank you, Jordan. Rhoda, thank you for co-hosting with me tonight. And everyone, thanks for tuning in from across the region and across the country. And we look forward to seeing you again next Tuesday night, same time, same Zoom link, and we'll continue the discussion with soil health. Have a great evening, everybody.
Thanks, everyone. Good night.
Good night.